Welcome back into another Arrowhead Pride Chiefs training camp report. I am Steven Serda. Day 5, full team practice. The pads were on Friday, so let me welcome in the leader of Arrowhead Pride, Pete Sweeney. There was a heat advisory in St. Joe today. Sween, how hot was it up there?
Yeah, it is extremely hot. And one thing that you noticed besides the injuries because of the padded practices is because I think of the heat, it was chippier than usual out there. I know that Travis Kelce had moments where he yelled at both DiCaprio, Boodle. There were referees in attendance. At one point, he was yelling at the referee for not throwing a flag on George Karlaftis, yanking him back in coverage. So some agitation, some chippiness that you see with every camp that has finally started here on Friday.
Yeah, and you mentioned the injuries, and first day of full padded practice for the Kansas City Chiefs, and Andy Reid confirmed linebacker Isaiah Moore was out with the knee injury. Kadarius Toney obviously out. Turk Wharton still not on the field, and Drew Tranquill strained his neck. Tight end Jody Fortson hurt his shoulder, and defensive lineman Mike Dana strained his calf. So not really, not the worst thing in the world, but not the greatest start to padded practice for the Kansas City Chiefs on Friday.
No, and of those injuries, I would say that Drew Tranquill, it seems to be minor. Again, he went right up the hill and didn't participate after he suffered the injury, but that seems to be minor. I think Dana, the calf strain, you wonder. Remember, he did miss a little bit of time at the beginning of last year, and he's even more important now that Frank Clark is out of the mix. That's worth monitoring, but again, a little bit more of a minor vibe on that one. The Jody Fortson injury rolled up on by a defender in the end zone, and you could just tell he was in a significant amount of pain, and I would say laid on the ground for about 30 or 40 seconds before getting up, and eventually he did jog off on his own, but it seems to be a right shoulder injury, and we'll just have to see on that one. Of the three, it does seem like Fortson's could be the most serious, but again, we're still 40 days away from the regular season, so there is time for these guys to take their time on the way back, make sure they're healthy for when the games really count.
Yeah, it's not. We've talked about this so much, Pete. Like, we have so much time before we really have to start worrying about it. So first day, full padded practice. It's really, really hot outside, and it's going to continue to get hotter and hotter. So the Chiefs are going to play it safe with all of these guys. So I don't think, barring some other kind of like significant report, I don't think that we should be stressing about this right now. We got plenty of time for all these guys to get healthy and ready to go for the regular season.
Yeah, it wasn't anything like non-contact or anything like that. So I think you're hoping for the best. I tend to think they're going to run some tests on Jody Fortson just because it seemed like that, again, could be the most serious. And we'll just have to find out more tomorrow.
And it's time for our daily Chris Jones update. We talked a lot this week about hopefully he would show up by Friday for the padded practices and at least like hold in so you feel a little bit better about negotiations because he's at least on site at St. Joe. But as far as we know, Chris Jones is still not there, and it's starting to get a little worrisome whether or not they're going to come to a deal at some point before training camp's up.
Well, I've been saying it, and we said it on reports leading into today's, is that if he's not there on Friday, this could be a long haul type of thing. I think if he wanted to just prove a point and show up to camp at a reasonable amount of time, today would have been a really, I think, ideal day to do so. First day of pads, you don't really miss a ton until the padded practices start to happen, which, like we've been talking about, was today. And then Andy Reid, and Steve, I don't know if you caught this, but asked about it at the podium and just simply said he's not communicating with Chris, and the vibe that you get from Willie Gay speaking a little bit on it, and Andy Reid himself is like, we just keep on rolling here. So they're in the mindset right now, like just not having Chris Jones until I think this thing gets settled off the field. But I think it remains in an extreme stalemate, and Jones seems set on not really caring about those $50,000 dings each day. He's gonna sit out until he feels like he's compensated with a new contract.
He's just saying, yeah, that signing bonus is going to pay for all these fines. Like whatever we get a deal done.
That is correct. Yes.
So we'll continue to monitor the situation. Hopefully Chris Jones shows up at some point. Hopefully we see a sign that things are moving in a positive direction for the Kansas City Chiefs. And I want to encourage you guys. We just posted a new episode of Show and BK this morning. We had a long conversation about Chris Jones and just what he means. And obviously he's going to play for the Kansas City Chiefs this season because he's under contract through the season. But we would like to see a long-term deal in place and see him on the field at training camp. So I encourage you guys to go check that out. We had a long conversation about Chris Jones and everything that he means for the Kansas City Chiefs defense. But it was the first day of padded practice, Pete, and you tweeted out Mahomes actually connected with MVS for a long touchdown. And I feel like we've spent so much time talking about this wide receiver room and all the guys that we're hoping that we'll see big things from this season. And Marquez Valdez-Scantling is kind of the forgotten guy, even though he's probably the surest, safest guy who's going to have a significant role at the wide receiver position on this team for the Kansas City Chiefs.
Yeah, I was optimistic last year coming in that maybe Marquez Valdez-Scantling could be more to the Chiefs, than he was in Green Bay with Rodgers, and one of these guys stretches out the field and can make these big time catches, here and there, and maybe more of an all around receiver who could push to have 1,000 yards. And I just tend to think he is the guy he was in Green Bay, which is fine, which is a solid contributor on the Chiefs. Somebody that's going to get you between 600 and 800 yards, that is going to make a big play every once in a while. It's when you talk about how many yards he usually records per reception. But I still think this room is going to have to lean on some young guys to fill that void that is left by Juju Smith-Schuster departing the Chiefs for the New England Patriots. And you're starting to see, I think, good signs from Sky Moore. Rashee Rice has looked good. Justin Watson, to me, has looked very reliable here at camp. And then you have the Justin Rosses of the world that are trying to make this team. No more John Ross. He called it quits and decided to leave Chiefs camp and retire. So you'll see if one of these younger guys can take a step forward and support Marquez Valdez-Scantling in those efforts to make sure that they have enough pass catchers.
And I want to remind you guys, if you're listening to us on the podcast, immediately following the break, we'll have all of today's press conferences today. And we heard from Andy Reid, and Andy Reid was actually asked about the John Ross retirement. And he was just like, he didn't really say much. He was just kind of tired of it, which I thought was like, Andy Reid's not usually that upfront with it, but it seemed like John Ross was just not having any of Chiefs training camp.
Well, as is constantly said, Andy Reid runs one of the toughest shows in the league when it comes to training camp. And a big reason for that is making sure that these guys have wind under them when it comes time for January and February, especially now when you have the 17 regular season games. Let's say you don't win the bye, you're going to be playing 4 more games before you're trying to lift the Lombardi Trophy. So it's 21 games. So it's these days in St. Joe and the heat that I think builds some of that oxygen that you might have later in the season that you wouldn't have had you not done that. And yes, for lack of better terms, Steve, John Ross had enough. He didn't want to do it anymore, and I can't blame him for that.
And I think he was a long shot to make this roster for the Kansas City Chiefs anyway. So I don't blame him.
I think it was one of those things where you're right. Like, he saw the writing on the wall, probably, looking at some of these younger guys as well that are pushing. Even I think, now we've talked about in recent days the Chiefs potentially keeping 7 receivers. I don't think John Ross is going to be one of those 7 receivers. So at some point he said, "What am I doing here?" and left. And that's it.
So it's, congratulations to John Ross on retirement. I hope he enjoys it and has a wonderful post NFL life.
That's really kind of you, Steve. That's very nice.
But so, Pete, something we've been talking about like crazy, and the first few days of camp before the pads went on was second-year cornerback Najee Johnson was getting a ton of run and opportunity here with the first-team defense. But it seemed like on Friday it was kind of back to the rotation we expected. Jalen Watson in, Trent McDuffie, L'Jarius Sneed. And I think it's safe to say Najee Johnson could still find a way to make an impact on the defensive side of the ball, but I think those first few days of camp, it's just kind of Steve Spagnuolo trying things out and seeing what he can do with the first team. And now we probably got to look at what the actual first team is going to be on Friday.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was always going to be Watson. Now, Watson is somebody who is rotated with Joshua Williams, just depending upon the defensive looks. And I tend to think that could be the case in 2023 as well. But I think if you really wanted to put money and feel like you're betting on who would be the third cornerback for the team, and it's going to be Watson. I think the Chiefs just were trying to see what they have in Najee Johnson. I think what they learned is Johnson can do the job. The room is deep. You see injuries that happen every year. So if that were to happen in the cornerback room again, remember Trent McDuffie missed a big chunk at the beginning of last season. I think the Chiefs would be okay. And I just think what a story to have all these guys that are in their rookie contracts, Steve being the elder statesman who really isn't that old, leading that cornerback room. I just think that the Chiefs have more or less an embarrassment of riches, young riches, when it comes to what they have going on in the cornerback room. Up front in the second level, remember we mentioned that Drew Tranquill had to leave early, so it was back to the Gay and Bolton show. Bolton was back after missing practice the other day due to an illness. And then up front, we had mentioned that Mike Dana had to leave early. I thought Malik Herring really popped today, and he's somebody that I have in my bubble. I didn't include him on the roster in that first iteration of the 53-man. And I tend to think he is somebody that needs to perform really well to make this team. It's now or never mode for both Herring and Joshua Kando because the Chiefs did draft B.J. Thompson. So I thought it was worth mentioning in those offensive line versus defensive line drills. I thought Malik Herring looks to be one of the better rushers today.
Yeah, that's interesting if Mike Dana is unavailable. I think Dana is kind of the forgotten guy along that defensive line, though. He was really valuable for the Chiefs last season, and he was a really effective player, and he's kind of a guy that gets overlooked. So be interesting to see if he can get back on the field and continue to pay attention to what that defensive line is going to look like, especially as Chris Jones continues his absence at training camp. And on Friday, we heard from head coach Andy Reid, linebacker Willie Gay, guard Trey Smith, and safety Brian Cook. And I wanted to ask you about Brian Cook, Pete, because I feel like we haven't talked about him a ton, and he's, again, on the defensive side of the ball, we can't really learn much until the pads go on, and the pads went on Friday, and Brian Cook is a guy that I think, again, kind of gets lost in the shuffle when we talk about this Chiefs young defense and that secondary. And I think he is going to be a significant player for them this season. And he's going to have a real opportunity to be an impact player in year number 2. And I really liked a lot of what he had to say when he took the podium today.
Yeah, well, he has to be. Juan Thornhill's now a member of the Cleveland Browns, so he's going to get a lot of that time. And I think he learned a lot from Juan Thornhill. The word he used with Thornhill was perseverance. He really learned that in this league, you're going to have tough times. You got to keep battling. We know about Thornhill's story with the injury and not really feeling like himself to about 2 or 3 years later. And last year, he really earned a nice contract from Cleveland, stay in the AFC, and now he'll move on. When asked about Justin Reid, you'll hear it in his voice from the podium, but I think Brian Cook was almost moved to tears with how much Justin Reid has meant to him both on and off the field. Now they're going to be, I think, really a nice tandem as far as being in sync and making sure that everyone has the calls and the checks. That is something that he has focused a lot on, is just knowing the defensive playbook really well and working with Spags to do that. And he feels like he's in a good place where he can make the calls, play fast, doesn't really have to think about it. And I feel strongly about the second year of Justin Reid. I mean, the thing that stands out about Reid is he said he was still kind of learning the whole system, in that last fourth of the season last year. And so I like this safety room. I think it's a year that Brian Cook will show that he can fill the shoes of Juan Thornhill. And I've mentioned it before in one of my bold prediction takes. I just think Justin Reid is so comfortable. He's so talented now that he's going to push to become an all-pro.
And I think Justin Reid, it was a couple weeks ago, he even tweeted out second year, I know the defense now, look out. And so I do think, the safeties, we spend so much time talking about the cornerbacks, and I think the Chiefs have a really good safety room too that we should not overlook during training camp.
One of the best parts of before training camp, Steve, and so if you're a Chiefs fan that really starts to lock in during training camp, you might have missed this, but during one of the pressers of OTAs, he was like, yeah, you know, in other places that I've been, we've only run like 5-6 plays. It's like, Justin, you've only been in one other place. They're talking about the Houston Texans. So he's happy that there's multiple looks in the Steve Spagnuolo defense, and he seems to have a stronghold on it.
He's Pete Sweeney. You can follow him on Twitter at PG Sweeney. And as always, please make sure you subscribe, rate, and review everything that we're doing here on the Arrowhead Pride Podcast Network. Follow all of our training camp coverage at arrowheadpride.com. Chiefs are back on the practice field tomorrow. We got you covered all weekend, Saturday and Sunday. We're working straight through with the Kansas City Chiefs. So make sure you're locked into the Arrowhead Pride Podcast Network, and we will talk to you guys tomorrow afternoon.